что ж, давайте продолжим.
So I think it's time to pick up with our next topic, and Andrey Sarafanov will be presenting now on World of Tanks and the evolution of tanks there from SD to HD. Andrey has had a number of jobs in his career path, and he ended up joining Wargaming in 2013, where he is now a senior CD artist. Let's give him a warm welcome. Well, thank you guys so much. I'm very happy to see you here. Today I will be discussing how we were developing HD tanks for World of Tanks. A few words on myself. To start with, I'm now based in Minsk, Belarus. I was born in Tatarstan, which is in Russia, on the Volga. I studied in Kazan Aviation University. And after I graduated there, I started my first job as a programmer at an aircraft factory, where I was using CAD systems to create 3D models, and based on that, I was programming the machinery that would create aircraft spare parts. I was very interested in gaming. I was constantly looking at it, as a hobby. And a local jeweler actually saw me do that, and they asked me to do jewelry models for them. And I joined them. They had internet where I was working for this second job, so I could learn more there. But I was doing pretty much the same thing. I was creating these models of jewelry, and then we were using Wax 3D printer to manufacture them. And after that, they were manufactured out of metal. After some time, I started to work with a local casual game development studio. I've been, I think, highly skilled in Photoshop by the time, so I was doing 2D imagery for them there. They were small games, but it was still fun. But I was still creating models. I was working a lot with these guys, with some tanks. And in 2014, I decided I had enough experience to create an open access lesson, which I uploaded on render.ru, and pretty much at the same time, Wargaming started to do HD tanks, and they saw me, and they invited me, and I've been at Wargaming for over 3.5 years. I'm now a senior 3D artist, and I work with just those, with tank models. So let's kick off with the presentation per se. This is, I think, how game industry has been handling tanks. I still remember the Battle City game, 1985 title, 8-bit game. Everybody would just call them tanks back in the day. So that's where we started off. Next milestone for me was doing the battle for Arcades, 1992. A little more pixels and tanks, kind of seem a little more appealing. In 1998, of course, we saw animated pixel tanks in StarCraft with much more definition and some fun animation. 2004 saw Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War, which was already using 3D models with very low res, but still they had some fun effects there, and despite low res textures, they were much more realistic. Thanks to that, in 2010, World of Tanks was launched, and now I'd like to show you how our tanks looked in 2010 and 2013. The budget for that was fairly low, and we had between 7,000 to 13,000 parts for such a tank, where we were using Photoshop, using a lot of photo textures. Depending on how artists saw his or her task, the result could be actually very different, and the looks of each machine differed depending on that very much. I think these models would now work for a mobile app, but not for a AAA big title. In 2013, the decision was made to go level up with graphics. And 2013 was, of course, the year when we had Battlefield 4, GTA 5, BioShock Infinite, Metro Last Light, Assassin's Creed, Black Flag, and so on. And I remember that time when we were seeing everyone talk about PBR, and we had new tools that one could use to work with that, and we wanted to improve the graphics, but we were limited with the hardware used by many of our players, which varies a lot, and many of our players use low capacity hardware, and we had to balance out the graphics that we've dreamt of and the hardware that we had to place it on, and we created the requirements for that, and based on that, 10 artists created 10 tank prototypes. It was a 9.0 version when we first had our HD tanks, and it was about that time that I started to work at the company. And based on that first experience, we created a pipeline for our HD models, and from that time onwards, we were further tweaking and improving it. Here I show how the low poly model digitalization has changed from SD to HD. On the left, we see an HD model, and on the right, it's an HD one. And you can clearly see how many more details there is. The round shapes are much more rounder, and now we were able to show the rear side in a much better quality. Give the surface much more interest and variety as well, and not be as limited with the poly as we were originally. The textures have changed seriously as well. This is a old HD model, or SD model rather, and this is a new one that is using physically ligated rendering now, and the right one is much more true to the material, and the metal there reads much more cinematic and much more interesting. Let's quickly look at the anatomy of the HD tanks that we have. We're limited by the number of polys that we can use is 50,000, and the tank is broken down into several modules. The red one is a turret. We use the textures about 2 by 2, and the gun itself also uses up about as much for the chassis. It's also a similar size. We use different tracks for the hangars, and some of the tracks sometimes the track is a separate mesh, but for the game there are also different textures, and the sizes are here on the slide. The biggest, of course, is the hull, which uses a 4x4 texture, but all the resolutions that you see here is what our artists use. Unfortunately, we cannot ship it, and we have to condense it. The texture set is available on the right. The albedo, glossiness, metalness, normal AO, and camouflage. For the first four, we compress them in half, and the lower two 4 times. We have a lot of tanks, as you know, in the game. They vary greatly. Some are easier to make, some are much more harder to design, and some of them have guns that you can improve and upgrade. Therefore, you can sometimes create a number of guns for one tank. turret, of course, is an easier thing to use, but sometimes we have a history-based, a long history of improvements to the actual historical tank. Therefore, we have to rework a lot. For 1 year, we had 350 tanks to rework, which were already in game, and we had to make them in a better quality. We had to outsource part of it. We did much of it internally, though, but to do that, we had to have our very organized pipeline so that the end quality will be comparable no matter who did this or that design. So let's have a look at our pipeline. We first start with historic consultation. These are the guys who are actual historians, who work in archives, who collect photographs, articles. They compile an info set for the artist. Before I joined the company, or when I joined the company in 2014, this is how our pipeline looked. It was basically a Word doc with a description of the tank, its sizes, the models that it can employ, different guns, different turrets that it could use, and we had a reference to the texture folder. And this was not that convenient because sometimes the folder could contain about 500 textures, and when you were looking for a specific small element in the mechanics of the tank, and you could only have one photograph out of the 500 that you have that could be helpful to you to make it true to the historical prototype. So it wasn't very convenient. And then Pavel Grigoriev, one of our artists, gave us hope. This is the pure ref program. He created a pipeline for our historic consultants that has really smoothed things out for us. Now we have just fewer ref files when we have a new machine to work on, one for the chassis, one for hull, and one for the turret and the guns. And say if we look at the hull, then this is how the structure of the file looks. There's a front, there's a rear, there's a top, and there's a right and left sides to the tank, and I'm not sure you can see anything there, but all of these have elements that are linked. The artist has to work on. Say this is the light, the front light, and then it has an associated number of files and references that the artist could use to create that light. And this really accelerates the process for us, and it's also easier for the historians to check how we perform, because the references are much more reliable now. I'd like to really thank our historians for doing this, because now the models are much easier for us to design. So our output is a low poly model. I'm not going to spend much time discussing how we do it. There's no big secret there. Perhaps the only secret is this small scheme that we use in our work, which is a great aid because it demonstrates the dependency between the cylinder diameter and the number of segments that you could use. We have a min and a max for that, and this allows us to cool some hotheads that would sometimes use, a pixel size wire with hundreds and thousands of edges, and now there's a limitation. Even if it's a small element, you cannot overuse the number of segments that for that element. But for the large ones, you also have the minimal level, and whatever is round should look round. The low polys that we create are sometimes based on photogrammetry. Two of our artists, Mikhail Litvinsky and Alexei Yankovich, for instance, they guys created this tank based on the photos. They photographed the tank on every side, and then they used the photogrammetry technique to read information out of that, and this is the first tank designed on the basis of photos. Now, if we can find a tank in the museum, then we send a team of artists to go there, and they take photographs and do the photogrammetry. Say, most of the Swedish tanks that we did were using this technology. Originally, we had the sizes for our models, and then we added the photos, and then we were historic. This was true to life, because the drawings that we can get, they don't always actually correspond to the actual drawings that we used to make the tanks. Say, this tank here is missing some elements on the top and on the left. So this is the result of the photogrammetry for this one, but we have the correct size, and this already is a good start for the artists. Another thing that we use photogrammetry for is for some small elements, such as logs, I don't know, or some humps and bumps on the hull, and some uneven elements on the body of the tank. And another thing, now that we're talking about the low poly, you have to have the final look. But some of the tanks use some tissue for various needs, and before we can do a low poly of the tissue, we start normally with a high poly, and then we have to downgrade it to a low poly. To do that, we use the program called the software called Marvelous Designer. We create it there, and then we work with ZBrush, and then we end up in Maya to do the topology, and eventually we have a normal map in the end. Next is a UV map, and to do that we have also a number of limitations because our tanks use a lot of camouflage, and it could be easier if we didn't have the right tank here, for example. When the camouflage is really crossing over a number of different level elements of the tank, and therefore the camouflage has to fit the mapping, and we have to make sure that there are no problems at the junctures there. To avoid that, we have the rule that if the elements are located as here, say these little openings on the tank, if they're there, then the camouflage mapping is linked to the physical structure of the tank. So we end up with these red lines that will anchor the camouflage to those areas to make sure that the camouflage is uninterrupted in this specific area of the tank, without any gaps, without things looking back at where these hatches are. Here I am demonstrating how different camouflages operate. It's only some of them that have this problem potentially, but we have to make sure that our every mapping that we do fits these requirements. If we don't do that, then we could end up with camouflage going one way here, the other way there, and this does not really look that well in the final product. And how do we do the UV mapping? Well, we originally did it manually, but it turned out that it's labor-intensive and quite hard. Now we use UV layout to do that. It has a great option that we can do. Here's a short video also that demonstrates that. We use Maya to place every shell where they should be for the camouflage to be on point. We have the small boxes that UV light allows us to create. After that, we do the pack, and in some seconds, all the textures will be packed. Very dense, very nice. We won't be able to use it Photoshop, I think. In Photoshop, after a while, it looks fairly chaotic right now, but all the big elements, they stay in place, and they've been UV mapped, and we have the camouflage in place, and the mapping is works very handy, and it's easy for the artist and doesn't take a lot of time. After we did the mapping for the low poly, we move it to QA. The historians check it for its truthfulness to the historic inspiration, and art QA guys also check for how good we did technically, whether the polys are right, and whether the general art quality is okay. After these guys are happy, we move on to high poly. We use ZBrush to do that. Don't don't smooth the models. We just take the low poly, then we show where the hard and soft edges are. We close the gaps, and then we upload it to ZBrush. Like this wheel, for instance, we closed the gaps. We added some bolts. It was easy to do in using Maya, of course, in a circular format there, and then we point where the hard points are, and then we devise things, and then we smooth it out and upload it to the ZBrush. We then do the dynamic meshing there, and then we add whatever damage is necessary. We pay a lot of attention to historic references. We frequently visit museums, or we visit the military units where we could take photographs that we could use in our future work. Tanks are not perfect, this is no sci-fi. They're frequently very bumpy, far from being smooth, and the rubber elements are often rigged, and the ribs are hardly ever straight. If it's a thin metal piece, then it can be torn, it can be clunky, and there's a lot of welding that you can see on most tanks as well. At the same time, you can see that the actual style of production that you could see in you can see that this is made in one country and that is in another country. We use those references. We create a visual library for us so that the artists could reference that in their work. Here I demonstrate how we work with that in the ZBrush, where there's welding, where there's metal cutting, where there's some damage. This is what we do in ZBrush. Is also a short video on how we do the imitate the welding. Sorry, it's a bit slow, but you just go with the brush, and there's this long pattern that is tiled and spread along the edge here, and it imitates the cut. We could do the same with weld. Here we see that this is the end of a slate, and then it was welded, and that's what we do for every such edge. Like this start has some weird ones, and you had some cup bits there, and some fancy attachments here and there at the front, and as you could see, these screenshots have no texture. We don't add any patterns to the text, to the tissue, for instance, here, but when we sculpt, we try to avoid that. We only do that in the Photoshop because that's much faster there. At the same time, you see, I pointed where the UV seams are going to be. We try to add some texture there so that the seams will not be as visible. Because where UV shells are going to be, there could be some seams which will be very visible when we move it to Photoshop. Therefore, we kind of prepare it before we do things in Photoshop here. After that, we use the Maya to bake with all. We create this model, but it's very smooth, as you can see. It doesn't have any sculpting, any molding on it. And now we have to add the various surface details here. I have the photos of how it looks in real life. It's a cast metal, rolled metal, rubber cloth. Rubber cracks over time. We have a normal map pattern. You can overlay so that that's easy. Rolled metal is kind of smooth, but when you have any damage to it, so they look like little bits here that are kind of very neatly located. For the cast, it is a special texture, of course. It easily fills with dust, actually, when you do the textures, and it looks yummy. Now, more on the cast. Say, if you look at the Cold War period tanks, this is M103 cast element. It looks very smooth here, like you could see in Doom, for instance. But T-34 here on the right, the cast is much more different and actually much more appealing because technology was not as good. So it's not as smooth, and I think it would look much better in the game. Therefore, we sometimes use this effect even for the tanks that didn't have it in real life.
Ну, каким методом мы
So what methods do we use to add texture? One of the options is to assign a material to all of the shapes, cast iron, etc. It will all have different colors. So yellow is thin metals, which won't have any texture at all. And after baking, we get this color map here, and we can use it to Photoshop by referencing colors. And we have the finished tiles. We use them to correct them using Photoshop levels. So we use the levels command, choose the blue channel, change its value from 255 to 127. After that, our texture looks like this, and then we use it by mixing in hard light mode over our texture. And this allows us to create a texture just very easily. So our task is just to choose the right mask and get what we need. At the same time, a tank is a very unique thing, so we have a library, but it's just a reference instrument. Our artists want to add additional elements. For example, different fastening that we can use. So we have a brush for that. It's important to turn off the shadows in the render menu, so it's a checkbox that you have to uncheck and assign this DL normal map material to the object. It can be found online very easily. That's where you can find it. The standard brush shader, it doesn't work on that. Don't use it, use that one. After we assign it, we get this view of our mesh. Let's take a different view of it, and we get practically the final map. And then using Photoshop, we can use it on our model. So in Photoshop, I placed this type of fastening very easily on top of the turret. So the next slide has a very short video of how I sculpted the Wargaming logo, so I can sculpt very easily, add elements. I even it out right opposite the view, assign a material, and then I make a screenshot. Okay, so I will copy the screenshot. It goes to memory, install it, place it in where I want it to be. I already know where it should be for this specific tank, for this particular tank. But the tank already has a texture. I use the hard line mode. I turn off its levels and you see how the color changes. So we got rid of the contrasts. And this is what it looks like. Looks pretty nice in the hard light mode. So I save it and you see what it looks like in Maya on the tank. It's a very simple step. We sculpted it, put it in Photoshop. So we don't need a special brush. That's pretty inconvenient. So here are some examples of the final normal maps. We won't stop here because the resolution is not very high here, but you can see that the fabric has a certain texture, even though it's 400 pixels per meter, but you do see some detail on the screen. On the next slide, you can see how the casting will look like, some unique elements which this American tank had. So you can add tears to the fabric, but unfortunately we can't see that very well here. So some final normal map elements can be added in Photoshop, so the lights, the windows, it's just a thing you do in Photoshop to make it look realistic. So after finishing the normal maps, it's again time for quality assurance. The historical consultants and the art QA guys, they check our model so that it's realistic, it's correct. They check the normal map so that the seams are in the right places, the texture is placed correctly, so we don't have any new seams. Everything needs to look nice. After finishing this step, we move on to texturing. On this slide, I have a map that we used for our shader. So it's normal map, albedo, glossiness, and metalness. We have 10 nations in our game. That's a lot. The content has grown over the past 7 years, and all of these tanks have a different color for their nation. Our director, Vitaly Lashkov, had a challenge to make the tanks different, but then make them easy, make the texturing process easy to control so that they don't become too different. So here's an example of 3 American tanks. We can see that different artists made them using different approaches, but in general, the machines look like they've been made from in the same way. So one tank looks a little bit more rugged, the other one not, but they do look pretty similar. At the same time, if we take a look at the vehicles of different nations, we see that the approach is similar. So they are all made for a world of tanks. The style is very similar because the texturing approach is the same. What did we do in the past? So we had 2 SD tanks. 2 different artists made these tanks. So somebody prefers darker tanks, somebody prefers lighter tanks. And then we turned out that the tanks were really different. We used to line up the tanks of the same nations, and it turned out that we had tanks that looked very different. We wanted to get rid of that to make the tanks unified in a way. So we collected a lot of reference material. Not many people know this. Tanks in the factory are just covered in metal. After that, they have a primer. So we have a red primer here. After that, they are painted. And over the paint, we have dust coming on. So here are some examples of wear and tear. The top center example, look at that one. So we have a bright polished material. Then we have some rusted metal. And at the edges of the rusted metal, we see the primer. And over the primer, we have the paint covered by dust. we reproduced the same structure in our layered structure so that our artists could reproduce the same texture very easily without any additional efforts. So the structure is the same. We have the fresh polished metal in the center, then the oxidized rusted metal, the primer, the paint, and the dust. But all artists have different preferences. Some add more dust, some add less, some have more wear, some less. And in order to balance that out, for tanks of different nations, we decided to make reference tanks. We chose the S3 tank with photogrammetry that we just saw, and using this reference tank, we made reference tanks for every nation. We took this tank, painted it for USSR tanks, French tanks, Chinese tanks, etc. And we defined very specific criteria for each tank for the color of the country, for the primer color, and the dust color. The dust is more or less the same for every tank, but the primer is different sometimes. The reason for that is that Soviet tanks are dark green, for example, and we wanted to have the primer be of a warmer color, whereas British and American tanks are light, and a colder primer looks a bit more interesting. So we vary the primer colors for different nations. And at the same time, adding dust, we use the same dust. But on light tanks, the dust looks less impressive, so we have to take it to 100%. At the same time, we cannot use it in the same way on dark tanks because it just looks like dark blotches of dust, and we lower the opacity to 40-60%. We have requirements for every nation, and we follow these requirements. And now I'd like to say a few words about applying dust to the tanks. Usually dust consists of 3 components that we mix using a mixing components. For every mesh, we have a gradient map. This map changes the color from top to bottom. It could just be a black and white mask. Then we mix it with the cavity map that we get from the normal maps using some instrument that we need. And then we use ambient occlusion that we need for the PVR shading. Then we mix the 3 maps and we get the more or less final result. That's practically the final result of the dust map. But it requires some finishing by artists because texturing of the tank takes about a week and a half to 2 weeks. We are very focused on this process. That's the final stage, and the tank really has to look good at this point. We try to apply more dust to the sides of the tank and the turrets and a bit less dust to the top of the tank. And thanks to that, glossy becomes looking more matte on the sides and more shiny on top. So the surfaces look nicer. We also add some final artistic touches. We have splashes on top. If the crew got in the turret, probably had dirty shoes on, so he probably left some foot tracks, some splashes, and we do try to make it a little bit more artistic. What's more, we add scratches so that the dust looks more interesting. So it doesn't look like we just generated it and forgot about it. Our approach to metal is even more serious, so we go again to our historical consultants. They tell us how the tank was used because all tanks are extremely different. So this vehicle had a hatch which the crew used to get in. He also could climb turrets, so I recently had an opportunity to climb in some tanks, and that's pretty difficult because there are specific places where it is easier to get in the tank, and that's how we created tracks that the crew typically used. So these places have a bit more wear, and that's also where we add some scratches where we need it. For example, on the bottom, that's the place where it has a lot of contact with the environment and it sees a lot of wear. We also try to have more wear around the edges. On this picture, we see how on the edge of the hatch, the intensity of metal increases because that's where the crew grabs on to open the hatch, and it's only makes sense that this part has more wear. Besides from metal and dust, we add special details, so fabric masks, blinding, scratches from exhaust. So there's rust. We add some additional details. We add oil, maybe. So to be more clear, I'd like to say a few words about our pipeline. We started with Photoshop, together with DDo and NDDo 2. These two plugins were very useful to us, but we switched to Quixel Suite pretty quickly. We used it for about 6 months. It was an interesting experience. They didn't have 3D drawing available, and we started considering different packages. Today we have all our artists use 3 packages for texturing. Nobody uses Quixel to texture, but some artists use Mari, sometimes use Substance Designer, and most use Substance Painter. Little by little, people are switching to Painter. And I add texture in Photoshop in in Painter myself, so I wanted to show you a video about how we do that. We do have some tricks and tips that I wanted to show you. So when I put the detail in the Painter, I see the details, I see the hull, the turrets. I only left the hull here for this presentation. I usually add 3 texture, ambient occlusion, curvature, and normal map, and using these textures I can generate what I need, the maps that I need. So I will try to gradually show you the elements that I add. So this is a pretty sophisticated layer structure. The first step is usually the special materials, the different headlights, wooden details, ropes. Whatever details should be drawn separately, where metal looks different there, not like everywhere else. Here you see this birch tree that we made using photogrammetry. In the beginning, we see that there's almost nothing, only these materials that I already have. After that, I can start to add dust. So this is the first layer of dust. It's a pretty raw layer, unfinished. So this is the first level of generation. We see at the bottom there's no dust. So we have different masks that we use to create a more interesting texture, but the result is pretty raw. It's not enough for us, and we try to continue processing. Just like I already showed you, we use the curvature map to generate dust, which we see smaller details on. We add scratches to the dust. They make it a bit more diverse. The next step is adding softer looking dust. Everything looked harsh, so I want to soften things up. And I get rid of the dust where I wanted. So I deleted it from the ropes. Here you can just remove it and add it from the headlights too, so it doesn't really mess with the look. Sometimes I just want some details to shine on the final product. Then we add metal. So here you see areas where the metal is dark. They have primer on them. In the next video you can see that in more detail. just to see how we create this wear easily. We don't really need to create it separately. We just use a special tool which allows us to simplify the process. And here I add some additional drips, steps where the crew was moving around, where the tracks were moving, where the splashes could be. And that's basically, oh, and here I can show you how the grid becomes darker, so it looks a bit more 3D. Sometimes I do that in Photoshop because it's not super convenient to do that in Painter to work with a lot of details. Sometimes we make the masks the masks in Photoshop and put them in Painter. So little by little, the tank is looking more and more interesting. So we spend about 2 weeks on the tank. We add the darkening from oil. So when tankers work, their gloves are usually very oily and they can make the hatches darker. So that's why parts of the hatches are darker. And in the end, we see that glossiness, metal, albedo are all present there. Probably everybody knows that Substance Painter can show us all of these 3 channels at the same time. So this is what it looks like in Substance Painter. This tank has several weapons and I textured them all together in the same scene. So when I switch the material, I can switch from one element to the other, or I can look at them at the same time so that they look very holistic in the end. So this is what our vehicle looks like in Substance Painter. And now I would like to show you our little magic instrument. The thing is that we draw metal and dust. So we looked at different levels, right? But all of these levels are drawn in one black and white channel. So we see that we have color, roughness, metalness, and reflections here. So when I add reflection, you see I wrote World of Tanks here. When I change it, the color changes. In the black and white map, we draw it. It's separate. But see how it works on our texture. Now I will change its brightness. If I take dark, I see dust. If I take it to white, then it turns into primer. See? And the farther I take it to white, the more metal we see, the more wear we see. And the same values exist in glossy and metalness. So we draw it in the same black and white map, and we see the result in all of the maps because they are all connected, related. And so using these simple steps, I can create very sophisticated wear in the metal, in the primer. And if I change the color to black, then I will be drawing with dust. By mixing these layers, I can get a very sophisticated picture. I won't need to draw the coat, the primer with a different step, the metal at a different step, because it's a lot of time. And this allows us to have a lot of freedom for creating very interesting textures in a very short period of time. The final step after creating these textures is creating the camouflage map. We use the black and white texture that I just showed you, and we use it to create, well, okay, so here we see the hull in black and white, and where we see the metal, primer, and dust, oil, those things are all black. When we put the camouflage on, the camouflage in those places is worn. We don't see it. So this is where we see the metal, and if I put on the metal, or put on the camouflage, I still see the metal because we have a special texture which allows us to maintain the details that we just drew. So we keep the scratches, the writing that we want to keep, and we can add on different camouflage. We keep all the details that we already drew. The next step is to make a crash model and a loader tank. I won't really spend a lot of time on that because it's not that interesting. And to wrap things up, I want to show you our unique tanks. So this is the Type 59 Gold. It was made for the Asia region. It's made in gold. It has a very unique look. We also cooperated with creators of Fury, the movie. We worked with the film crew and we got pictures from the filming process. And our artists in real time created this tank. The result was really nice. I think on the movie release date, we had a version completed and the tank was on sale. Also, our artist created the Rudy model from the movie, 4 tankers and a dog, a Russian film. And we have the entire crew here available as well, and a dog whose name is Sharik. So that's what we can do too. And we had a really good collaboration with Sega. They had Valkyria Chronicles. They make anime tanks, as you can see on the right. But our task was to make these tanks more photorealistic. And they also went to the Asian region on consoles. For PC versions, we didn't launch these tanks. I actually worked on the second tank, this black one, Nameless. And we also created unique crews for these tanks, and they speak Japanese, just like in anime. So some people really appreciate this. This is what the final model looks like. This is what I rendered in 360. That's what our tank ends up looking at from all sides, with all the textures. So you can look at the different textures, and that's basically all I have to say. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope it was interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but if you do have questions, you can ask Andrey personally. The presentation was extremely interesting. Thank you, Andrey.
We're here with another one of the participants on 4C. Hi, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jean-Philippe Morel from Ubisoft Montreal. I'm working on Rainbow Six Siege.
Very nice. What was your first video game ever? Do you remember it?
Oh my god. I did a port of a very. Oh no, I don't want to talk about it. It was called War Chess. I don't know if anyone knows about it, but it's just a port of a PC game to console game on PS2 or like 15 years ago. But my first real game, I would say, was I worked on Prince of Persia, several Prince of Persia at Ubisoft.
That's very nice. What was your first video game that you've played?
Oh, the first that I've played. Oh, on the Atari 260, 100. I don't know if I say it correctly in English. It was called Smurf.
That's an old one.
Yeah, it's a real old one. Yeah, it's an old one.
And well, now that the time has passed, what's your favorite video game of all time? Do you have one?
Of whole time. Oh my God, that's a good question. I would say I spent a lot of time playing Unreal Tournament a while ago, but yeah, Unreal.
The very first one?
Yeah, the very first one. Yeah.
Absolutely. What led you to the video game industry? How did you come here?
Oh, it's a technical challenge. The technical challenge is, I first wanted to make graphics, but I realized that was not really my thing. I like to build machines, like machines that can scale, that can live for a long time. The technical challenges in video game industry is.
And now that you're in it, what's your favorite thing about the industry? What do you like most about it?
It's the same thing, exactly what I said. It's building machines, building bigger machines, machines that scales. I'm not even that interested in the nature of the game. That may disappoint you, but it's more the machine that I'm building that interests me. And I have a lot of creative people around me to make some good games.
So it's the technical side of things that you're into.
Exactly.
All right. So anything you particularly don't like about the modern state of the industry, maybe?
I worked with really big teams. It's not really that I don't like them, but I prefer some smaller scale team, probably. But that's the first thing that comes to my mind. What else? Oh, that's pretty much what I'm thinking about now.
Fair enough. Let's make some predictions. What do you think will be the new thing, the new big thing, the new trend in the gaming industry in like 10 years' time?
Oh, in 10 years' time? Well, I won't say it's new, but I think there will be more and more games that lives for a very long time, that evolves that over time, and I think that's a trend that will continue over the next years.
Do you think it will be like a breakthrough point through some game, or it's just going to be like a slow progressional evolution into this state?
I think it's going to be a slow evolution, and I think it's going to be a slow evolution mostly because we need to adapt to that kind of mentality in the game industry, and
fair enough. If you had absolute creative freedom, which I don't know, maybe you have, but still, like absolute creative, financial, professional freedom, what game would you like to have made?
I will keep that secret if you don't mind.
We almost had an announcement here.
I have good ideas, but I will keep that for myself.
Okay, but that's a secret then. Is it a secret on what do you think is more important in games, like graphics or gameplay, or maybe the storytelling?
No, I think it's everything is building a community and make it that community grows and grows and grows, and make that community grows over time, and so we can build on that for many years on the same kind of titles.
Okay, great. Let's return to the real world for a second from video games. We're in St. Petersburg. What do you think about the city?
Oh, we had a good time yesterday. I was just trying to find a good place to go, and it's awesome. We had a tour of the whole city. We had a boat trip. It was awesome. It was awesome, really.
Right. What about the event itself for C? I know it just started, but still, any impressions?
Oh, I can't wait to see I can't wait to see the talk Friday and Saturday. I want to know more about what people think about the future of gaming industry.
Maybe something specific you're looking forward to, some specific speech or lecture?
Yeah, I'm very interested about monetization. How monetization, I told you I like big machines, build big machines, and monetization is something that we need to learn a lot. How it works, how we integrate that to game, and I'd like to see how other developers are doing that. Some massive online infrastructure. Also, I want to see. I want to hear more about that. How people doing that.
If you were interviewing yourself right now instead of me, what would you ask yourself?
At what time is the party? Saturday?
Well, I guess you'll have to answer this question yourself. Either way, I have you have a great time at the party and you have a great time at the event itself. Thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you very much.
So we keep catching our speakers in the hallway and putting cameras in front of them. Hi, please introduce yourself.
My name is Samuel Ranteskla. I work for Microsoft as a principal program manager out of Sweden.
Okay, Samuel, so let's talk about games. What's your favorite game?
Well, I wish I played a lot more games than I actually do. So I have to go back into the past. Like one of my really favorite games is Jag the Lions 2 from like 92, 93. I think it was made here in Russia, if I'm not mistaken. Civilization, always been a big fan of that. And then the Enemy Unknown UFO trilogy from the 90s. There's so many games, I mean, it's like impossible to select one. But they're all strategic games, the ones that are my favorite.
Yeah, you're obviously a tactician. That's commendable. But do you remember the very first game you've ever played?
Decathlon, probably on the x86, somewhere around 84.
Wow, that's... I don't even remember that one.
It's like you basically play Decathlon and you just hammer at the keyboard to go faster, like 10 different sports events. Played it like crazy. I was 8 years old then.
Wow. How did you get into the gaming industry?
It was by chance, actually. So I was studying at Uppsala University, doing computer science, and they had this fair where companies were meeting the students. And there was these two guys that they've started a game company in the basement, and they wanted somebody to write a BSP tree, binary space partitioning tree. And I was looking for my thesis, so I figured let's combine those. So I joined them, I wrote my thesis in the games industry, and then from there on kind of like just went on. So this was 2000.
But now in 2017, what's your favorite and least favorite thing about game dev?
I mean, I think the games industry is awesome. Great place to work. There's so much passion. There's skilled, very intelligent people. I think That's my favorite thing. The least favorite thing is that, which I covered in my speech a little bit, I think that we're looking a little bit too much at how do we turn time into money, rather than seeing like how do we educate our kids. I really want to, that's my passion myself, is like take this experience, make our kids better tomorrow than they are today. I'm a parent as well, so that's coming from that.
Well, that's a very noble thing to do.
I don't know if noble, just I think it would be a good thing for us.
Definitely is. About your speech, did you have any interesting questions that maybe stood out?
Yeah, there was some interesting questions, like if we look at mixed reality, what's going to happen with that? What's the dangers with that? I couldn't really answer them because let's see what happens.
But if you were a part of your own audience, what question would you like to ask yourself?
That was a tricky one. Are you sure that you're right?
Are you?
No.
Well, we can be sure 100%, but still, we're trying to foresee the future here. How do you like the conference?
Love it. St. Petersburg, great place. Wargaming, excellent hosts. It's a great place to be. You should come to the next one.
Definitely do. Say, if you had the chance to go back in time to when you just started working in the industry and give yourself one advice, what would it be?
Try one of your ideas out.
That's very good. Thank you very much, Samuel. I hope you like the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.